But abuse is basically any repeated pattern of behavior that terrorizes family members. It includes obvious, objective forms of physical violence or threats of physical violence towards the spouse or the children. It can also include abuse that is more subjective in nature.
We haven't really defined what abuse is, because I'm hearing an increasing amount of conversations, and I think it's the influence of the critical social theories coming in that's redefining abuse as, well, anytime there's a power structure or a power dynamic, and then the person who's in the oppressed class gets their feelings hurt, then we're in the realm of abuse. But I would love to have a more clear definition of what qualifies as abuse. Like, is there the social service textbook definition for that, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I know for me, when the right questions are asked, then when you get the dynamics of the relationship that is clearer, I think it's helpful. I think that oftentimes pastors don't want to ask those questions because they don't want to be too invasive with the questions, because they want to be able to give the husband the benefit of the doubt that he's not abusing. And they usually take what the husband says at face value without probing too much. I don't think that's helpful, because abusers will often be really nice in public, so they can easily manipulate others with their charm or their charisma or even their knowledge of the Bible. I've had a lot of those experiences with couples where the spouse will, weaponize or use their knowledge of the Bible to kind of fall under the radar. But abuse is basically any repeated pattern of behavior that terrorizes family members. It includes obvious, objective forms of physical violence or threats of physical violence towards the spouse or the children. It can also include abuse that is more subjective in nature, where it's verbal abuse, relational abuse, emotional abuse, and even spiritual cruelty, which destroys the mental, relational, emotional, and spiritual stability of anyone in the family. Drug abuse or alcohol abuse is a form of abuse in the marriage context, as these addictions can create opportunities for a spouse to lie or to be consistently deceitful, violent, or financially unstable, making the family feel very volatile in their ability to kind of sustain itself. I would even consider gambling addiction to be a form of abuse, because it can lead the family to financial ruin. Of course, lying is often part of the gambling addiction. I know this is very controversial, but I feel personally that porn addiction can also be abusive, since a husband is committing sexual immorality with a screen, and then they expect their wives to mimic that behavior that they see on the screen, which I think dishonors the wife considerably. I know that many Christians deny the reality that husbands can be sexually abusive with their wives, but it does happen, especially when the husband is addicted to porn. Sexual abuse towards a child in a home falls under, for me, a different category of abuse. This should never be tolerated or endured for any length of time. If there's any suspicion that a pastor thinks sexual abuse is happening in the home towards a child, it is crucial for the wife to separate the children from their abusing spouse immediately. Sexual abuse is the kind of abuse that needs immediate intervention. If a pastor comes across any case where he thinks it's suspected, he needs to stop family counseling and make a priority to get the victim to safety as quick as possible. There needs to be an active and intentional attempt to separate the child from the perpetrator by seeking outside church counseling to determine the degree of the kind of abuse that happened. Sexual abuse counseling is a specialized kind of counseling and should never include asking the victim to forgive right away, especially if it's a child. The consequences of sexual abuse is mentally and emotionally complex, and the victims often experience physiological and psychological symptoms and consequences for years. So this is not to say that at some point, like when a child becomes an adult and they want to move towards forgiveness, that they can do that. But at the time that they're a child, I don't think that's helpful. It's actually abusive to do that. The problem is that when cases of sexual abuse land on a pastor's desk, the heaviness of the situation is often like, whoa, this is big. I don't know how to deal with this. And it often paralyzes the person that's trying to help them because of the gravity of the situation. Pastors or elders who retain any information on this information, that when they retain or gain any information that this is happening in the home, they need to just be able to go into action. And, if they have to call the police, call the police. But they need to really make sure that the victim is no longer having access to their perpetrator. And oftentimes pastors are not willing to do that. They want to keep the family intact as they're trying to gain more information. I don't think that's helpful. I think separating the child from the abuser it needs to be priority, and pastors aren't often willing to go there with that situation.
Gosh, again, you said a lot that I definitely agree with in regards to, and I'll start here, in regards to the sexual abuse issue, and especially where children are involved. If I'm not mistaken, when I was working in church, pastors were still mandated reporters. Mm-hmm. And so the issue of, getting outside counseling and making sure that they have sexual counseling and all of that for a child, that still to me is secondary. The first priority, like you're saying, is safety for the child, and especially as a mandated reporter, because that can, and not to go into all of that, but that can bring legal ramifications upon your church. Yeah. That can bring legal ramifications upon a pastor if they fail to report, if it is known that a pastor fails to report abuse, sexual abuse, and other kinds of abuses too against children. But I know when I was working in church and in social service, being bivocational, there was, a very clear line in the sand of what was to be reported and to who and by when and all of these things. So you definitely hit it on the head with, as a pastor, and I think children's pastors might see this a lot more or hear of it a lot more if the parents, in my case anyway, a lot of my kids came to church, but their parents didn't come. And so I would hear different stories from kids, and now here I am in a mandated reporter situation. It's not my job or the pastor's job at that point to arbitrate or to say if this is real or not real, because at that point it's been reported and I am legally required to take the next step. So I think that's part of that whole sexual, or abuse situation with children that just takes things up to an entirely different level. In regards to the different types or forms of abuse, I remember learning and having the conversation of the 5 major different types of abuses. So you had emotional, physical, sexual, and I just was running through them in my head and now I've lost 2. Emotional, physical, sexual, emotional.
You already said that one.
Emotional. I already said emotional.
Yeah.
Verbal, and then there's one more. And everything that Ariel is talking about can be placed in one of these categories. And so if you have someone who struggles with alcoholism and things like that, that could be placed under a category of the potential for an emotional abuse, but it could also be placed under the category of a potential for physical abuse. And so we look at these different categories and how they can be highlighted or brought out in an abuser. Yeah. But the definitions for these different things, I think, yes, these are the definitions, but it gets subjective, especially when we're seeing this, to your point, in the conversation of trauma, because while you look at something with children like the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and it says these are the things that qualify as traumatic. Just because I go through that does not necessarily mean that it's going to be traumatizing. I'm going to have some of the reactions of a trauma response.
So some of those things would be if a parent is incarcerated, or parents get divorced, or a parent
dies, or you face physical threat. You have, or you witness something happening.
Parent job loss. A critical move. I'm imagining there's some objective things that count. But what you've taught me is that just because you go through something doesn't mean that it's traumatizing for each person in the same way.